Okay, today I'm starting a new series that's going to be on Balkan history. I'm going to be trying to understand Balkan history, and I'm going to use this book right here as my guide to Balkan history. I might be adding some stuff from like online sources, talking to friends, maybe even some connections to personal experience, stuff like that. I used to live in the Balkans, so the history is it's close to my heart. I want to understand this strange region for a variety of reasons, and one of them is that, well, I used to live there. So mostly I'm going to be relying on Misha Glenny's The Balkans, Nationalism, War, and the Great Powers, and I will definitely consistently in many different places be arguing that although Balkan history is quite complicated, it's less complicated than people seem to think it is. A lot of the impenetrability and incomprehensibility that people ascribe to Balkan politics either comes from racism or paying too much attention to nationalist narratives of what Balkan history is like. Yeah. So I'm going to be focusing on the Balkans. I'm going to be using this as a guide. And today I want to talk about the introduction to this book and also just some of the things that make Balkan history interesting. So Misha Glenny begins his book by trying to define the Balkans and pointing out how difficult it is to come to a definition of the Balkans, and then talking about where those difficulties come from. So the giving you the short version, the main reason that this is so difficult is that the Balkans originates as a geographic distinction that is rooted in a misconception. There's a mountain range that extends from Bulgaria uh, to a part of Serbia, and it was originally believed that it extended all the way to the Adriatic Sea, I believe. And the idea was that this formed a sort of nice little pocket. You've got this sort of peninsula, and then you've got a mountain range at the top, and it turns out that that mountain range does not extend all the way in the way that cartographers originally believed. And so you have this geographic distinction that sort of doesn't make sense and leaves open this sort of slippery ambiguity to it. And this eventually gets tacked on to political distinctions, which are a little bit different. Like originally, the concept of the Balkans politically was regions of Europe that are controlled by the Ottoman Empire, which is obviously a thing that changes over time. Like Misha Glenny points out, if we were to stick to this definition rigorously, it would mean that at certain that as the Ottoman Empire recedes, so does the Balkans. So you've got these different definitions that don't quite line up with each other that people use to discuss the Balkans. And one person I want to bring into this topic is actually Slavoj Žižek, a Slovenian philosopher and raccoon given sentience by an evil bog witch. So Slavoj Žižek says that no country wants to be in the Balkans. And he says essentially that every country that is in the Balkans tries as hard as they can to come up with some pretext for arguing that they are in fact not in the Balkans and that they never have been a part of the Balkans. He singles out, I think, Croatia or maybe Slovenia or both of them, and says that as they have pursued closer and closer ties with Western Europe, they have argued that this indicates that they are not a part of the Balkans, and that essentially there are only a few countries that have failed in some way or another to fabricate a claim that they're actually secretly not a part of the Balkans. And similarly, or like contrary wise, certain countries, when they're trying to argue uh, that some part of Europe is somehow backwards, it's not really a part of the Western project, they will kind of infect it with the stink of the Balkans by arguing, for instance, that Hungary is a part of the Balkans. And from certain perspectives, Zizek argues, you could even say that a country like Austria or Germany is infected with the stink. So the Balkans, I think, is defined from Zizek's perspective as being a region that no one wants to be a part of. Like I could imagine him arguing that for a definition that is rooted in not wanting to be part of the Balkans. Like you can tell that you're talking about the Balkans when you have a country that where people distinctly want to avoid being lumped in with the Balkans. So places like Slovenia, for instance. Um, okay, so that's the ambiguous position of the Balkans. It's an interesting region. right off the bat, in that people can't even agree what the region itself like actually is. Uh, and I also think that it's interesting to me because it's crucial to it's a crucial driver of European history, and it's a crucial driver that is disavowed as a driver of European history. I think that people's first impulse when thinking about the role of the Balkans in world history would probably be to think about World War One, and I guess I'm no different because I think that's a good place to start when thinking about the effect of the Balkans on European history. But the way that this story is told, is essentially that the Balkans unwillingly dragged the rest of Europe into this conflict, and that there was no like there was no like agency on the part of Europe in going to World War One, and that this was basically a spillover from the Balkans. So I actually want to read directly from the book. So um, he quotes from another book called Imagining the Balkans in relation to this argument. So here's the quote: "It is an intolerable affront to human and political nature that these wretched and unhappy little countries in the Balkan Peninsula can and do have quarrels that cause world wars. Some 150,000 young Americans died because of an event in 1914 in a mud-caked primitive village, Sarajevo. Loathsome and almost obscene snarls in Balkan politics, hardly intelligible to a Western reader, are still vital to the peace of Europe and perhaps the world." So this guy's position, this guy that's being quoted, is that the Balkan politics really don't matter. It's a shitty region and we should all just forget about it. And that it is an affront to human dignity that these stupid Balkan people somehow drag Europe into wars. The Balkans is like Europe's problem. And the point that Glenny makes, which is a really obvious one in retrospect, is no one is forcing the rest of Europe to like get involved here. It's not like World War One. It's not like Russia and Britain and Germany woke up one morning and they didn't understand why they were in war. Like the countries were involuntarily like signed up to go to war. Certainly, maybe the people living in those countries didn't understand the political machinations that were happening. But the reason that this stuff happened, the reason that World War One began, is not like incomprehensible. It's because the countries of Europe cared enough about an issue that was happening in the Balkans to go to war with each other. And sure, that war, maybe they wouldn't have cared enough to go to war with each other if they knew how devastating the war was going to be. But it's not like it's not like they just woke up one morning and Serbs had snuck into everybody's government buildings and signed declarations of war. No, this is European politics. This is European politics just playing out and leading to war, and the conflict that they're fighting over is one that originates in the Balkans. So it's ridiculous and, in fact, quite racist to assume to imply that this is something that in which Western Europeans just don't have any agency. Yeah, so that's what I mean when I say that the Balkans is a driver of European history, but it's a disavowed driver of European history. People don't talk about these events as a situation in which the Balkans is something of central importance that Western European countries end up fighting over. They talk about it as just some incomprehensible Balkan politics thing that has a splash spillover effect onto the rest of Europe, and one of those spillover effects is World War One, which is not a great way to understand these things. And the last thing I want to talk about in this introduction is this sort of incomprehensibility of Balkan politics. And this one is kind of interesting to me because it rhymes with the way that people talk about other regions. Like the Balkans is viewed as the periphery of Europe. It's Europe, but okay, it's not really Europe. And in that sense, it's also the first region, the region that's closest to what we would call the West, that's the first region that gets exoticized. And this particular Balkan form of exoticization is weird because it also comes with, like, they're just sort of in the middle, right? Like, no one would think of the Balkans as like, no one would, it would be weird to say that someone is orientalizing the Balkans, but that is something that absolutely happens. People do orientalize the Balkans. It's just that because the Balkans is thoroughly in Europe, and most people would recognize that it's in Europe, these terms and concepts that we've developed for thinking about the ways that people come up with problematic ideas for thinking about, say, the Middle East or China. There's somehow a blind spot for the Balkans. So people who wouldn't refer to sort of mystical, oh, you don't know why these conflicts happen. People just they have tribalism over there. They just love fighting each other. Those cliches, even in circles where those cliches have been set aside and removed from the discussion of, say, African or Asian politics, many people still feel perfectly comfortable applying those ideas to Eastern European or a Balkan context. And so there's this interesting way in which the Balkans' inclusion in Europe enables these orientalizing cliches to come back, even in polite society. Okay, so I also wanted to talk about the incomprehensibility of the Balkans. Yeah, I mean, I think that basically when people say that some history is incomprehensible, what they mean is that it's somewhat complex, and I have decided not to give a fuck. And that's it. There's nothing like ontologically incomprehensible about the Balkans. It's just that people don't really care. And I generally, when I think about the incomprehensibility of a historical region or a time period or whatever, I generally my litmus test is thinking about the events that led to World War One and the political dynamics that led to World War One. And people don't generally think of those political dynamics as hugely complicated, but they are quite confusing to someone who's never heard of them before, and you're not going to understand them after having them explained to you just once. You're going to need them explained to you 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 times before you're like, okay, I get it. And that's the type of thing where if we could imagine a world in which Europe wasn't like, I don't know, the dominant group on Earth. If we imagine a world in which China became the dominant group, and Chinese history is what was taught in schools all over the place, and European history was like a sort of, it's in it. You can learn about it, but you have to learn about it in like a special European history department. Then events like World War One would be taught as utterly incomprehensible. That's just what European politics are like. Like those people, they just love fighting each other for no reason. Um, and honestly, I think that claim is more true of European politics than it is of lots of groups that people claim that about. But anyway, that's why that's my litmus test, is because World War One is relatively complicated to newcomers, and so I think when I encounter an event that people say is just incomprehensible, you just can't understand this history, I ask myself, is this more or less complicated than World War One? And oftentimes the answer is that it's considerably less complicated than World War One. So Balkan history has a similar issue in that some of the things that happen in the Balkans are fairly convoluted, but they're not more convoluted than the events that led to World War One. It's just that people's appetite for understanding these things is significantly diminished when we're not talking about a country that like is Britain or France or Germany or America. The other reason that Balkan politics can be kind of incomprehensible, and I imagine this is a problem that other histories have. But the other reason is that there is a lot of fictionalizing that goes on, and that's a factor in all sorts of places, of a propaganda vision of history. But the propaganda vision of Balkan history, if you'll excuse me the joke, the propaganda vision of Balkan history is Balkanized. There's not just one propaganda version of history. There's like five of them. There are many of them, and they're competing with each other, right? And these propaganda visions of Balkan history, the history that's taught in Serbian classrooms and Croatian classrooms and Bosnian classrooms, these are lies and stretching the truth in the same way that the history that America teaches its own students are lies, except that they're lies that are sort of in competition with each other, which makes things appear much, much more complicated than the traditional situation you have, where you have a nationalist history that is obscuring some things that maybe a country doesn't want to talk about. Like in the Balkans, like all of the horrible crimes that have happened are on full display. They're just on display in like different parts of the country, different parts of the region. Like if you want to hear about all the horrible stuff the Croats have done, I'm sure they teach that in Serbian schools. If you want to hear about all the horrible stuff that the Serbians have done, they teach that in Croatian schools. So you have these like dueling brands of nationalist fictionalized history, which makes things a little bit more difficult to penetrate through. Like getting to the real history is ostensibly a little bit more complicated, but it's also more fun because there's more like narratives going on here and more like arguing that's happening. So yeah, learning about actual Balkan history is more fun because there is a more complicated like layer cake of fictions that go on top of that history. And as we'll see pretty soon, the way that those fictionalized histories come about is actually like a lot more interesting in the Balkans than it is in some other places. Like I would say the fictionalized version of American history, the way that that comes about is like, I don't know, kind of boring. But in the Balkans, what we're talking about is like are like traditions of epic poetry that chronicle the emergence of the Serbian nation, and that happen to tell a lot of half truths and straight up lies in the process. But then those epic poems get used as the basis for a nationalist vision of Serbian history. So yeah, it's a really interesting region. I hope you will stick around to learn more about it.